All right, here we go. All right, well, thanks, Kathy. So this is the meeting of the ESIP SOI Cluster on April 27th, 2022. I am very excited about our talk today, which is going to be given by Dr. Christian Pichot. So Dr. Pichot is coming to us from INRAE, which is the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food, and the Environment. His background is in forest ecology and genetics and kind of the commingling of those two things. And in fact, he discovered paternal apomixis, if I'm pronouncing that right, in plants, which I had to look that up, which is actually a form of asexual reproduction. That's pretty cool when you can discover something. That's awesome. But his work these days focuses more on informatics, and a quick scan of the many of his works in this ORCID profile reflect that kind of focus on informatics. And a lot of those works, I was really happy to see feature words like interoperability, sharing, discovery, topics that are right up our alley. So this is going to be a great talk. And then Dr. Pichot, on a personal note, I will say that I am going to muster all of my willpower to not ask you about the election, and I won't, but if you wanted to volunteer anything, I think none of us would stop you. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present what we are doing in the field of data management based on semantics, in the general context of a research infrastructure devoted to experimentation on ecosystem. So I slightly probably modified the title of the presentation as compared to what you proposed, but it will be focused on, of course, interoperability based on semantics. And also you are a working group about soil. My talk will not focus only on soil because the approach aims to be quite generic and is developed for all kinds of observation and not only soil. So I will be quite quick about the general context of this work. This is biodiversity and the ecosystem studies. As you know, it's quite complex because of the different interaction among the components. So the challenges are to understand the state and the functioning of this ecosystem, and especially in the general context of global change and climate warming in order to be able to manage this ecosystem. So to do that, research infrastructure are developed to propose tools for experimentation to the research community. And one of these research infrastructure, which is called AnaEE for Analysis and Experimentation of Ecosystem, has been developed at national levels in France, but in different countries, and also at the European level. And this infrastructure proposed different kind of services for experimentation, either in control condition, enclosed facilities, or in natura, in fields, in different kind of ecosystem, as well as mobile instruments in order to be able to measure different components. And it also offers some facilities for data management and modelings. So I already explained what is the general objective of understanding the state and the functioning of this ecosystem. The AnaEE infrastructure is part of a more global, more general context, a cluster of infrastructure devoted to study of environments, which is called INRAE. Maybe you know this INRAE community. And AnaEE, in this context, participate to different projects that are conducted within the INRAE community. And the present project is called INRAE FAIR. As I explained, some facilities are either in quite controlled condition or in natural, are in fields, are proposed either for forest ecosystem, grassland, or lakes. These three ecosystems are the main ones proposed for the study using experimentation proposed by AnaEE. As kind of illustration, here you have some information about what kind of variables are measured in the field of lakes. So there are long time series occurred from sample in different lakes, and in France it's in Alpine lakes, Geneva Lake. And this information make it possible to have the evolution of the different feature. Here is plankton and phosphate according to time. And as you can see, right hand side, there has been a strong decrease, for example, of phosphate concentration along the 40 years ago. One of the main challenges that has to tackle the AnaEE infrastructure is to deal with the heterogeneity of the data that is collected from the different platforms, either in enclosed or in natural condition. And the objective is to properly manage data in order to be able to propose this data for discovery purposes, and also not only for discovery, but also to access and to reuse this information, this data, considering that information is initially quite distributed along the platforms, and also heterogeneous either by nature or considering the way the data is managed. So in order to do that, we developed a kind of strategy in order to be able to manage data that are initially collected at the platform level, and most of them managed in a local relational database and sometimes only flat files, to be able to reuse this, to manage this data and to produce and to feed metadata portal and to produce data set to be pushed in data repository in a quite fair approach, that's to say, with the objective of developing interoperability, not only technical, but semantic interoperability at the metadata and data levels. So the issue is to know how it can be possible to do that. So the approach we develop is based on the modeling, not only of the variables we measured, but also of the whole experimental system where the data are occurred. So that's to say what kind of site, what kind of treatments that is applied to the experimentation. All of this information related to data and related to the experimental context has to be modeled in order to develop interoperability, to homogenize information, to develop interoperability at the metadata and data levels that will be produced by the pipeline. So to develop this homogenizing modeling, we selected one ontology that will be used for the modeling of the experimentation. And this ontology, maybe you already recognize it, is the oboe ontology. I will talk about it. So the semantic approach based on ontology is mostly based on the identification of the component of the system. So for example, here we have some elements that are identified as air, tree, or soil. And associated to this element, their features, temperatures, soil water content, and so on, tree size. So this element, after being identified, have to be modeled using our ontologies that is used as reference for all the experimentation developed within the AnaEE research infrastructure. So the oboe ontology is quite generic, is based on the concept of a measure of an observation, that is realized on one specific entity, for example, an observation of a tree. And this observation is made of one or several measurements of different traits or different characteristics. So, for example, we measured a tree for a characteristic that is 8, and for this characteristic, we have a value, unit, the standard, and maybe precision, and also maybe some element related to protocol. So this brick made by observation and measurement is a very generic one and will be used for the modeling, not only the variable level, but all the level of the experimentation. This is more or less the same thing. So we have to identify the different elements that are contributing to the experimentation, and to model using the core brick of the oboe. We have to model this information, building a kind of graph. So after this first step, we produce a graph representing all these elements contributing to the measurements in the experimentation, and this graph will be used to transfer the data initially managed in relational database, to transfer the data, the kind of lifting, in a graph database that is built with the ontology, the oboe ontology extended for the needs of the AnaEE experimentation. So this is only a kind of transfer of data, but not only transfer, this is also an enrichment of the data using all the semantic information due to the modeling, the semantic modeling, as I explained previously. From this graph database, it will be then possible to reuse this information, querying part of this graph in order to produce dynamically either metadata records, for example, compliant with the international standards such as ISO or GeoDecat, or to rebuild dataset that will be pushed to data repository. And presently we generate dataset at the netcdf format. This ability to dynamically generate either metadata records or dataset is made possible by the fact that all information has been harmonized due to the fact that the information is modeled using the same ontology, that is the extended oboe one. So the vocabulary we use is mostly the oboe extended ontology, but we also used mostly to feed the list of naming, such as naming for sites, naming for variable, and so on. We used another kind of vocabulary that is a Thesaurus, that is called AnaEE Thesaurus, and that has been already published. So you know have access to this Thesaurus. Unfortunately, you don't have free access because it's not yet published to the AnaEE extended oboe ontology. And part of this element are linked through alignments, and mostly, as I explained, by the feeding of list of naming of the different entity described in the model in the model experimentation, feeding of naming list from terms coming from the AnaEE Thesaurus. So here's an example of what the operation lead to. So left-hand side, you have a map of the experimentation for grassland ecosystem with different plots corresponding to different treatment. And the upper part of the graph, right-hand side of the slide, corresponds to the modeling using the Oboe model with observation and measurement, modeling the different level of this experimentation. So if you start from the top of the graph, you have the description of the network where this experimentation is realized, is the ICBB network. It's the name of this experimental site for grassland experimentation. And so ICBB network will be the name as a characteristic, the name corresponding to the measurement of the observation of the experimental plot entity, experimental network, sorry, entity. And observations are related one to the other through the as context property. The network contextualized the site. So you have the description of the site in a similar way. That's to say, you have also the name of the site with information coming directly from the database. So that's why you don't have this value here in the graph. It will be retrieved from a SQL query associated to this graph modeling. So the observation about the experimental site, that is the second level of entity describing the experimentation, will make it possible to strictly identify the site, providing its name coming from the naming standard list that is also in the AnaEE Thesaurus vocabulary. A third level, if you go down in this slide, would be the description of the plot within the site, within the network. And you have the description of the plot with, for example, a control naming of the plot. So similar way can be done for different experimentation. So I won't explain so precisely the information about this graph. Here it's the experimentation on lakes, and you have in a similar way description of the network, the site, the plot, and below this general context, also using the as context property, you have the description of the observation of the variables. That is phytoplankton in water sample. So that's why you have an observation of the water, identifying the sample. And within this observation, or contextualized by this observation, you have the observation of the phytoplankton, where we have the value of the quantity of phytoplankton that is measured using a specific standard and corresponding to the characteristic volume per volume. So, as you probably understood, all the information that is initially managed either in a flat file or in the database can be modeled using the different elements of the Oboe brick, that's to say observation, measurements, and so on, with the objective of atomic decomposition of all the elements of the experimentation. And when you have performed this decomposition, you are able to produce the graph corresponding to the data that are initially managed in your database. So as an illustration of the extension we did of Oboe, here on this lower left part of the slide, you have some elements corresponding to naming standard of different kind of entity. For example, we already saw that we identified the network, the plot, the site, and so on. And for the identification of variables, either variables or variable category, we have as individual within the class of this ontology, we have a list of the different variable naming or category naming that have to be used in order to be sure to use the same way of describing the information from one experimentation and also from one side to the other that have to be used when describing the experimentation in AnaEE. So a global view of the modeling is the following. So you have in this lower part of the slide, the modeling of the observation, and in the upper part of the slide, the modeling of the context, that is either experimental context, temporal context, or spatial context. In OBOE, you already have extension for some elements, and especially for temporal and spatial. We extended the ontology in order to provide the elements that are necessary to describe the experimentation when not provided by OBOE ontology and the already provided extension. I will go directly to other, no. So, yes. Doing this work of modeling the experimentation can be quite time consuming because you should imagine to have to do this for all experimentation, all variables, and so on. So in order to avoid too long time devoted to this modeling, we had the kind of abstraction approach. We developed graph pattern models. That's to say, not identifying explicitly the entity or the characteristics as well as the standard in the part of the graph, but managing this information as variables that will be provided in kind of input parameters file of the pipelines that will treat this information. So, for example, if you measure nitrogen or phosphate in the soil, it will be variability. It will be different entity, nitrogen or phosphate, but the model, the graph model, will be the same. So, this graph pattern approach will make it possible to reuse the same graph for a large set of variables, considering that the information will be described in an appropriate kind of tabulated input file, as we'll see here. So we associated to this generic graph with variables, we provide to the pipeline the description of the variables as entity, characteristics, standard, and so on for the different variables. So one variable is described by lines, and by column you have the different type of elements that have to be provided to be compliant with the OBOE model. So the important message to keep in mind is that a generic graph can be used for a large set of variables, considering that the specificity of each variable is provided in this kind of tabulated input file. So this is more or less the same. So globally, you will generate a global graph describing all the elements using always the OBOE bricks, that's to say observation and measurements, describing the different levels of the experimentation from the variables to the network of experimentation, providing temporal context or providing special context. Here, for example, you have a description of the depths of sampling for some measurements of the observed variables. Associated to this graph and to the tabulated CSV file that provide information about each variables, we also have to provide for the different nodes the link to the database or to the flat files in order to make it possible to retrieve dynamically the information from the database to the graph, the database graph that will be generated. So we have to generate queries, and that will be associated with the graph. And we also have to provide the pattern of the identifier of each nodes using information coming either from the ontology or coming from the database, with objective, as you know, to have the same identifier when the nodes is the same, and to have different, of course, identifier, different URI when the nodes are different, in order to avoid the confusion among the information. So the general process is the following. We have an annotation model corresponding to the experimentation. This graph model is used by a first pipeline that that lift the data to a graph database that is then reused to the production of metadata records and an etcdf file. I will have a slide, I think, about this second pipeline that is called SemData here for semantic data. At this step, we select the element of interest from what is variable in this graph. So selecting using criteria about variables, site, project, if any, years of collection of the data, as well as category variables, networks, and so on. That's to say metadata, describing the information that has been modeled through the semantic approach. Now, selecting some of these elements make it possible to define a perimeter, a scope of interest. And the second pipeline, SemData, dynamically generate metadata records and dataset with the netcdf format corresponding to this perimeter. So you probably know a little bit what are netcdf files. They are mostly used for climate data and so on, but we also use this for all kinds of data from experimentation in the AnaEE infrastructure, because it's a self-describing data format. That's to say, the header of the dataset make it possible to have the description of all of the content. So here is a kind of explanation of what is the header of this netcdf data file. It's sorry, it's not for soil, it's for phytoplankton from lake samples. We have the description of the dimension of the matrix. A netcdf file is mostly a multidimensional matrix where dimension correspond to the factors. For climatic data, it's for example latitude, longitude, elevation, and time. But for experimentation, it can be, of course, spatial and temporal data, but also treatments, level treatments, and so on, repetition, replication. So these dimensions are described using the element coming from the annotation, the semantic annotation models. That's why here you have, for example, the characteristic that is described as the URI corresponding to the depths relative to surface, as described in the AnaEE ontology, that's to say Oboe extended ontology. Dimension as described as well as the variable observed. So, for example, it's for phytoplankton. So we have in the lower part of the slide, the description of the variable using, always using the semantic information that come from the ontology. So you can see that we can find the different elements that we model: characteristic, entity, standard, the name of the element, and so on, coming from the standard naming, and so on. So and value that corresponds to here to the location of the sample point. So it's quite important to keep the information with the associated semantic URL, semantic definition, in order to be sure that the exploitation, the interoperability of the data produced will be easy and properly realized. So as an illustration, so it's another illustration. It's one data set that has been generated with this system with only two variables, what about temperature of water or air temperature, but merging in a single data set, data coming from six sites, 6 experimental platforms. Initially, these data were managed in different databases, but considering that all this information has been modeled using the same ontology, they are directly interoperable and can be gathered, can be used to generate one single data set. So in this single data set, we have information about forest, lakes, and 2 and 3 mountain sites that can be reused rather easily through our interfaces and to produce graph and so on. This is just an illustration of how interoperability, due to the modeling using the same and unique Oboe extended ontology, can be realized. So if we have some times, I can also show you some example more related to soil. We worked 2 or 3 years ago with colleagues from Italy for the modeling of information related to soil map in Italy. And presently we are also working with some measurement related to soil in some sites. So if I have 5 more minutes, I can show you. Is it okay?
Please, that would be really interesting.
So I will start very briefly with, maybe with the modeling of soil information in one of the AnaEE site, forest site. So of course you can read the different elements, but you can imagine that each of these nodes are observation and measurements for different characteristics using standard and so on. And the different levels correspond, as already explained, to either to the variable level. So you can see that the variable entity, the variable standard, characteristic, and so on, are not explicitly provided here. They are coming from the description of the variables in an input file. This input file is as follows. I think it's the same. Yes. So here you have, for example, description of 35 variables. And for each variables, you have the different elements, either the name of the variables, the general name of the variables, category that is mostly used for querying when you already produce metadata or dataset. The context, considering that when, for example, when you measure soil water content, I think it will be at the end of this slide. Yes. Soil volumetric water content, that is the name, classic name of the variables. You measured not the soil, but you measured the water. Okay, so the entity measured is the water, and the entity is contextualized by the soil. So this is water in the soil. So the atomic decomposition is very important to be sure that you provide interoperable data. So you also have information about characteristics, standard, and so on, and other information. And some information can be directly related to the way you manage data in your database. So I go back to the graph. So these variables are replaced by information coming from the CSV file I showed to you, and other information come from the query of the database. For example, here the observation of the soil water content, for example, is realized in a new context of an experimental point, that is this experimental point contextualized by a spatial entity. And for these two elements, we have to provide the identifier of the experimental point, that is here the repetition coming from the database. And the spatial entity will be here the depth of the collection of the sample. So this is the lower part of the graph, and this lower part of the graph is connected through this this box to the upper part of the graph that was sorry. One. So I use the YED editor, YED graph editor. I don't know if you know about this software, but we use it to generate the graph and to associate, as you can see in the upper part of my slide, we associate information related to, I can see you, to the building of the URI. So here you have the way we construct dynamically URI for each node. So this is a common prefix, and this part is coming from the database as a variables. And this information, that's to say, that is dynamically retrieved from the database, is collected through specific query that address different tables where the information is stored in the database. So I go back to the upper part of the graph. So you can see that this observation 60 corresponds to what was identified here, 60. So there's a link to this two level. And this upper part that is common to all variables, that's why we split it in two parts, lower part specific to the different variables type, and upper part common to all variables. So this upper part provide more general information about the experimentation common to all variables. That's the name here. That's the name of the site, the name of the ecosystem, the name of the experimental network, and so on. Okay. I can also show you what has been done 2 or 3 years ago with colleagues from Italy for their database of soil description at the whole country, Italian country level, I think so. I'm not specialist of this data, but we work with colleagues from CREA you may know, Giovanni Labate, and we initiated the modeling of this information. So in this graph, we identify the different elements that make sense for the description of the soil. That's to say, for example, soil horizon, soil element. I don't remember exactly what exactly means soil elements and so on. Soil elements were contextualized in soil-derived profiles that were contextualized in some spatial elements where coordinates were provided. And this element was also contextualized in grid. It was probably a more or less regular grid for the description of the soil map, Italian soil map. So the principle is always the same, is to describe all the levels of the experimentation using elements coming from the oboe, either existing information, either extended for your needs. So I will stop that and go back to the end of my presentation. In a few words, what was lesson from this work? So as I explained, the generosity of the oboe ontology make it possible to have a very efficient atomic decomposition, atomic modeling of all the components of the system. And for AnaEE, it's experimentation. But in other case, it's not always experimentation. It can be only observation. So some extension are already provided by oboe, extension related to some characteristics, spatial component, temporal, standard, and so on. And some other are needed to describe what you want to describe. And so you have to add some new classes, and very important, you have to provide when using control naming list, you have to provide individual in these classes in order to be sure that all the partners using the same experimental component use the same naming, the same URI for describing this information. Using a graph pattern approach and not modeling each variable individually, make it possible to deploy this process for all the observed, all the collected information, with a quite reduced cost of modeling, because as you can imagine, a lot of variables can reuse exactly or nearly exactly the same graph pattern model. Okay, so when data, of course, are properly managed in your database through the query associated to the graph, you can easily lift data and to generate semantic graph, semantic RDF graph. And of course, it's a direct contribution and a deep contribution to fairization, because the semantic approach using semantic link data make it possible to have directly, not only technical, syntactically, but also semantically interoperable data. And the last one, I think so. Of course, in order to have interoperability among the data generated either from one side or from different side, you have to use the same ontology. In some cases, and for example, if we want to develop interoperability with data coming from other perimeters, other contexts, not from the AnaEE research infrastructure context, there will be need for some alignments among ontology if colleagues use the same approach, but not with the same ontology. So alignment is quite important for developing interoperability among set of data produced by specific ontologies, of course. Ontologies are usually domain specific, so we don't have to extend so much or too much the ontology and to reinvent the wheel when ontology already exists in some specific fields. And in the future, in order to provide additional information to the information we already model, we will use some element making possible to describe, for example, the sensor with SSN, describing people that are actors either at data collection or data management, and also the probably the prov-O ontology in order to model this information. And the genericity of the pipeline that has been used make it possible to use any ontology. So it's not at all related to oboe. So you can imagine to have a graph with a different mixture of ontology. Central part could be based on oboe due to the genericity of the central brick model, and other part could be used either SSN or FOF and so on to describe people and sensor and so on. And finally, we actually produce data using the netCDF format, but it's not so much used by our community, and it's not always well adapted to all types of data. So we have in a rather near future also to generate more table type formats of data, but always keeping the whole semantic information that is produced through the modeling of the experimentation. So we don't decided what kind of format it will be, but for sure, if we develop table type format for the generation of data, we will have to integrate the metadata describing the content of the data file, metadata conserving all the semantic information using the URL produced or associated to the ontology. So I think it's more or less whole. Probably you have some question. It has been maybe a little bit long as compared to what you suggested, so I'm a little bit sorry, but it's also a little bit complex. So please let me know if you have some question.
That's great, thank you. Looks like Daniel, you have a question?
Yeah, I think you got there actually on the last slide. Your model is putting in basically a unstructured an unstructured graph wrapper around a bunch of extremely structured data. Now, the world is going to the NoDB unstructured realm, but in the last two statements, you mentioned that you want to get back to supporting structured data, as in data tables. How do you see, or why do you think that that is important today or possibly in the future? And do you believe, would you not think that maybe we need to get away from that model?
Yeah. Presently, we have to go back to kind of structured data, either in netcdf or tabulated flat file formats, because mostly because of the size of the data set that are generated. When you transform data, when you lift data from initially managed in database to graph database, you increase maybe 100 the size of the data set. So it's not presently, for considering the large amount of data we produce from our AnaEE platforms, it's not possible to keep and to manage the raw data, not only the metadata, as you understood, it's really the raw data in graph format. So this graph format is is presently a kind of intermediate step, making it possible to reuse this information for the generation either of metadata records or data set, but with the objective in order to reduce the size of the data set, to retransform, considering the selection you made on variables of interest, site of interest, and so on, category. Considering this is a sub-selection you made on the information hosted by the graph, you generate a subset of data that we produce with a structure format.
I guess the follow-up there is NetCDF is now affording, and they're going in the direction of also being able to go with the unstructured within the CF conventions. So
I think that more than structure, not structure, the more important point is the fact that we keep all the information about the semantic description of the data. So that's why we firstly selected the netcdf format with the included headers, making it possible to keep with the URL the semantic information. So from the netcdf files, you can regenerate the graph if you want.
thanks.
So Christian, I'm kind of asked for stuff here a little bit. And so I face almost I'm working in the same problem space. So I'm in an LTR. And you know, most of the LTRs, they're kind of faced with this situation where, just like you described, where we've got dozens, if you count student projects, even hundreds of different projects. They're all, you know, they're completely different, all unique. We've got to, you know, harvest that information, and we've got to put it in a structured format and describe it, and then put it in a repository with appropriate metadata so that it can, you know, be reused. But in my case, and again with other LTRs, I know that we have a similar workflow, but we skip the graph part. So we're going from the data, and then programmatically adding the metadata that then, kind of goes into the construction of a data set. Now, our situation is a little different in that we're working with a more rigid schema. We're working with that ecological metadata language, so we don't have as much flexibility. But I'm trying to, as you were going through your talk, I was trying to get my head around the advantages of if we incorporated this graph component into the workflow. So I guess what I'd ask, well, one, if you have any thoughts about that, but the other is if this is like, are there papers and documentation about this workflow that describe, what you've just gone through in your talk that we could kind of dig into a little bit more?
Yeah. I think the interest of the graph is not really the fact that it's a graph. The interest is that it makes it possible to have quite interoperable information, because the graph is based on the use of one common, one unique, one shared ontology. So this is the main point. The additional interest is, of course, that it's directly interoperable with all information provided with linked data approach. So you can share, technically, you can share this information. It's quite interoperable. But for our first interest is to generate semantic interoperability. And this is based not directly on the fact that it is a graph. It's mostly based on the fact that we use the semantic we use annotation using the same vocabulary. So what we develop is rather generic and can be used for other contexts. So it's only partly published and accessible. But of course, the idea is not only to produce data set, it's also to share the tools. So these pipelines are or will be available for the community using Oboe or any other ontologies.
Great.
So I had a question around how do you decide what is an entity versus a measurement? And how do you incorporate methodology into that? And then sort of related to that, how do you incorporate people who maybe interpret the same measurement differently or different measurements in the same way? So the idea that you've got multiple ways to interpret the data and motivations for collecting it. Sorry, that was a big question.
Yes, the methodology of properly shaped, decomposed, atomically decomposed is very important, and it's not so natural or easy when you start. But you can, of course, have a look at the Oboe ontology published several years ago by Madin and co. And what we have to keep in mind is that measurement corresponds of a feature that is measured in a unit. And an entity is only an object, and there's no feature. You have to qualify an entity. You have to realize some measurements through observation. So, for example, if you have a box, it's an entity, of course. And see, if you measure the weight, the height, or I don't know, the price, it will be measurements through one or several observations. And for each of these characteristics measured, you will have to produce the unit. And this is, I think this is the way to think about the identification of the different elements. And when you use, for example, most often we used as naming of variables something that is not atomic at all. For example, soil water content, we could consider that's a variables. But soil water content, we can understand when hearing that it's more than an entity. It's agglomerate information about the soil that is a context of the measurement of water for its content.
But you could
Yes.
imagine something like doing a pore water quantification where you have soil water now and you've got an observation on that soil water. So like a nitrogen quantification or dissolved organic carbon or something along those lines. Is soil water in that context the entity, or is water the entity there?
Water will be the entity, of course. Okay. And you measured proportion, the content of entity in the context of the soil.
Okay. So to build off of that, what if that soil water content was extracted under different pressures? So those in theory would correspond to different pore spaces. Would that different pressure protocol be recorded then as a methodology, or would that be building off of the entity structure there?
I'm not the specialist about pressure, the way you observed, but I can think that it will be the context of maybe the context will be on water or on soil, I don't know. You have to link the observation about content of water with the pressure, or to put this this context at the soil level. I don't know if the pressure is addressed to the soil or to the water.
So typically you put them on, say you put a core on a plate, and then you have different sections, and you're pulling the water out of the core from the bottom of the plate. So it's generally a lab experiment.
Okay. But another way, as you proposed, another way of describing this pressure would be to associate a protocol to the observation of the. It depends what would be the use of this information, because when you develop interoperability, you have the idea of merging information coming from different sources. And if you use the same naming for variables that are rather different because measured using quite different protocols, you won't be able to, or you will be technically able to merge this information, but it will not make sense because the protocol will be different. So if you have to test each time if the protocol is exactly the same and so on, maybe it would be more efficient to extract this information, not to put the context in the protocol.
Okay.
Okay, so I hope it was more or less clear, because it's not so, and I didn't find so much time. I would have planned to focus more on soil elements. So I present you more generic information or general information, not specific to soil, but the concept is really the same, and you can deploy this approach on every kind of variable. So.
Well, thank you so much for coming to talk. I think at this point, I'm going to stop the recording.